All right, so Hayden's here with me, Hayden Ludwig from Capital Research Center. He's got a big piece up on Breitbart today on Arabella Advisors. Hayden, let's do two things here. So let's reset people who missed our first interview last week. And I have to know, he's an investigative researcher, and Capital Research Center really are big supporters of Breitbart, and we're very grateful to them. And Hayden, I want to talk about Arabella, big picture, and then let's talk specifically about their efforts to push net neutrality. And I'm doing the bunny ears with my fingers because it's an absurd expression, a euphemism for a excuse for more totalitarian control of the internet. But we'll get into that in a bit. Let's talk about Arabella, big picture, and then we'll get into the net neutrality angle.
Sure, Alex. So we've kind of talked about the hierarchy of how this whole thing is laid out. It's a bit of a pyramid. At the very top of this whole structure, you have a guy named Eric Kessler. You've mentioned before, he's a Clinton guy, right? This guy used to work for the Clinton administration back in the 90s. Before that and after that, he was a staffer for the League of Conservation Voters, which is a big, quote unquote, dark money heavyweight, right? So this guy comes out of professional activist politics on the left. He even got in bed with the Clintons at one point, pun intended, in that he was on the Clinton Foundation for a while, Clinton Global Initiative. So this guy's very, very well connected to the top tiers of the left. Well, that's what he plays into this company he founds around 2005 called Arabella Advisors. So Arabella is a for-profit company. That means it doesn't have to disclose its clients or how much money it brings in, et cetera. But Arabella, it basically consults for the biggest foundations in America on the left. So Ford and Open Society Foundations, Tides Foundation. But its main thing that it offers to these groups comes from a series of 4 nonprofits that it runs. They call them the funds. Well, these funds move collectively about $500 million, north of $500 million every year. And that's money that originates in Arabella's clients, these major foundations. Well, what do they do with all that money? They often give it away in grants to other activist groups, right, like People for the American Way, for instance. But the other thing they do that we especially track is they create a massive network, some 340 plus what we call pop-up groups. And we talked about this last week. These are groups that they're effectively, they look like nonprofits, right? You wouldn't know at first glance. But really all they are is they're just websites, slick graphics with a big fat donate button at the top there that you can drop money into. But you probably never know it's actually going to feed this $500 million beast. These pop-up groups in turn attack conservatives, Republicans on every issue. When we're talking about today's net neutrality, they deal with healthcare. They attacked Brett Kavanaugh back last year. They deal with gun control, for instance. So they cover pretty much every base, and it's the way Arabella feeds its left-wing radical clients' needs without ever exposing them to the people on the ground.
Okay, great. So this is good. So you've set the stage here. So we've got, it's really this AstroTurf thing. It gives the impression that there's this massive grassroots initiative, all these various organizations, when it's really just the same group of people in one office building, it appears. And it talks about the concept of dark money, how they move money around in order to make it difficult to track and difficult to understand, that it's really just a handful of very passionate leftists with a cause and not some sort of a big grassroots movement.
Sure. So let's define dark money, right? It's a nebulous term. It's a political term. So
exactly,
there's really no single definition. But basically, it's spending from undisclosed sources, and usually this refers to what they call the 501c4 nonprofits. So the reason that they don't have to disclose their donors when they file annually, publicly. But in effect, dark money is really what free speech that the left wants to silence, right? So it's a term they throw around mostly to attack conservatives and people on the right while doing it themselves. I mean, go figure, it's the left, right? But the way Arabella's dark money particularly operates is, say you're a major foundation. You're a billionaire and you've got a lot of cash and you want to fund, pick any issue you like, right? Let's say climate change. You want to fund an activist group that pushes global warming policies on the U.S. Well, you don't want to get involved directly funding that sort of thing because, it's grubby and you don't want to get your hands dirty with that sort of thing. So you turn to Eric Kessler's unit, you cut them a fat check, and what Arabella does is they set up any number of pop-up groups, right? These websites that, again, are made to look like standalone groups. So you could say you could have dozens of these things. They could even endorse each other because most people aren't any the wiser. And these groups then can even have staffers that, as far as we can tell, are on Arabella's personal payroll, which means that it's a for-profit paying them, and we don't see any public disclosures. So all this stuff, all the money, all the main things in the agreements are happening behind closed doors in a way that is never revealed to the general public, even though the general public is the target for all this, right? So we'll see people out on the streets marching under the banner of a group called Demand Justice. Well, that's not a real group, is it? All of those guys are presumably on the payroll of Arabella Advisors because their organization doesn't file anything with the IRS, doesn't exist in IRS record. They don't own so much as a pen. So it makes it very tricky and confusing for people on the outside. And as you put, it's astroturfing 101. It makes a crowd of 10 people look like a crowd of 100 people. So it's very effective as far as kind of puffing up this activist movement, when in reality it's just a fraction of how big they want you to think it is.
Yeah, and this is the goal, and this is one of the tricks the left has, is they make it seem like there's this big groundswell of support. We had a pretty humorous story about the impeachment movement. There's so much impeachment talk, and then there was an impeachment event in D.C. yesterday, Hayden, and no one showed up. So it was advertised, and people trying to put it together. Literally, no one showed up at all. It was a total airball. And because people aren't nearly as fired up as and we've been tracking this for years about how a lot of these protesters are actually on the dole. They're actually getting paid. They have no clue why they're protesting. So this is a way of doing that, but with cash, to make it seem like there's a lot of organizations and groups and money and passion. And it's not really. It's a few people with vested interests and who are extreme politically. All right, so let's talk about net neutrality, because that's the subject of today's piece that appears at Breitbart.com. It should be on the front page, easy to access for you guys. Talk about how these groups, what they're doing to push net neutrality, why. Let's even start with a definition of net neutrality, which is not a real thing. It's a fake expression. So let's just start there and forge ahead.
Well, you said it. It's a loaded term, like dark money. It's political, not real. It amounts to federal takeover of the internet. And think about the key word there, right? Neutral, right? It's intended to make people think it's about making the internet a fair platform, right? A place where everybody is heard. Yeah, but that's nonsense. In reality, it does the opposite. It opens up the internet to government control and the government's bias. You know, the government isn't more neutral than the free market, right? So this is a term coined by people on the far left. I mean the socialist left, whose goal is all about controlling free speech. And I want to stress that this isn't a technical issue. It's often framed as something for people who work in high-tech industries. It's really not. It comes down to clamping down on free speech in the United States. So the internet's our most open forum because it's anonymous. It's not under the thumb of any one internet service provider, including the government. The consequence.
Sure, and so the goal with net neutrality is the argument they keep making is that there are certain that you can boost or deboost content and slow down certain content and speed up other content. And they're saying that this can be done unless we have net neutrality, where the government's in charge of that stuff. And but the problem is the problem they've identified, even though it's very hard to even understand what they're talking about. It's never been an issue in the past because we only had net neutrality for a hot minute. And it was never an issue for anyone. It was never when there was no one ever really has had a problem with a non-neutral internet in real life. Is there anyone who's really suffered from it, Hayden?
Right. It's a solution in search of a problem. Right.
That's right.
It's about that takeover mentality. If you understand that the left assumes the government's the answer to everything, well, then it makes a lot of sense. They really do see government as a neutral platform that's far more trustworthy than Comcast. And I'm not a big fan of some of the ISPs out there, but look, they're doing their jobs and they're out to make a profit. You can keep them honest with that sort of thing. But the government, as we saw with Lois Lerner, can be weaponized against people for their ideological views, for their religious views. So it's hardly the neutral platform, and it's hardly born out of a real problem that needs to be addressed. right?
Right. So why has this become such an obsession of the left? The left is very hot on this topic, and they have been for a very long time, even though it just, as you say, it's not really a major issue, yet it ranks very highly with a lot of the far left in particular are very concerned about this topic. So what's Arabella's involvement? So two-part question. Why do you think the left is so hot for net neutrality, and what is Arabella doing to push it?
Addressing the first part first. So I think it's a natural consequence of the left moving forward slowly on its war on free speech. They can't come out swinging against the First Amendment, right? So what they do is they go after things like campaign finance. Again, sounds like a technical thing that most people, their eyes glaze over. All it really means is how you give money and how much money you can give to campaigns, right? But that's about limiting your ability to support the candidates you want. Well, same thing with net neutrality. It's all about putting that open forum, the internet, in control of a group that can be manipulated. These guys on the left can't manipulate dozens of internet service providers, private companies. They can manipulate the government if they get in control. Look at the guys like Robert McChesney. He's my favorite example of this. Robert McChesney is one of the guys who is kind of the architect of net neutrality, one of them anyway. McChesney is an avowed socialist. We actually quote him on the piece on Breitbart. He's a former editor of the blatantly Marxist magazine Monthly Review, and I'm not exaggerating. They call themselves that. He really believes that we need to, quote, overthrow the media system in the U.S. with the ultimate goal of overthrowing the capitalist political economy. So this guy's a revolutionary he's talking about. So he sees this as the logical progression. Well, how do we get back to Arabella? So Arabella's own group, it runs a group called Media Democracy Fund. And again, this is just a front for a real nonprofit. So Media Democracy Fund is just a slick website. The real money behind it is the hundreds of billions of dollars strong New Venture Fund. That's a real nonprofit that Arabella runs. It's got its staffers on the board, for instance. It lives in the same office as Arabella. Well, Media Democracy Fund was started with grants from the Ford Foundation, from Open Society Foundations, that's George Soros' group, and a few called the Park and the ARCA Foundations, lesser known. Media Democracy Fund runs what it calls, again, another fund, Open Internet Defense Fund. It's the ironically named way of funding money to pro-net neutrality groups. If you go back to the Obama administration around 2014, 2015, the left was making a big effort to fund group like Robert McChesney's own group called Free Press. These were groups making arguments that the Obama administration needed to pass net neutrality regulations, right? Well, the way it went about doing this is Media Democracy Fund cut at least $90,000 to a group called Demand Progress. Well, Demand Progress isn't a real organization. This is another Arabella front group. So it's the equivalent of taking a check and running it from one end of the office to the other, right? So it's all fake. Well, Demand Progress's goal is pretty blatant about this. They want to, quote unquote, eliminate big money from politics. I mean, it's the irony of this group that's blatantly dark money, that's fake, trying to eliminate big money when they're part of this $500 million machine, right? It's not lost on these people, I hope. Well, Demand Progress's goal was pushing net neutrality from the outside in. So it kind of took a two-pronged approach with that group, Free Press, run by the socialist Robert McChesney. While McChesney's group was creating logical arguments for the FCC, Demand Progress was pumping out something like 700,000 public comments in support of net neutrality regulations. It had its supporters make 300,000 phone calls to the FCC urging them to pass net neutrality regs. So it was a really big campaign. Well, Demand Progress, in turn, gave money to Free Press. Free Press, interestingly enough, was one of the groups that the Obama administration saw as a key ally in its own arguments at that time, around 2015, in support of net neutrality. The Obama administration actually quoted Free Press 46 times. It was the biggest group that they quoted, cited in support of why we need net neutrality now, and they were successful. The FCC actually passed those in 2015 until President Trump undid them, I think, around 2017. So these groups are very, very well connected. They run tight campaigns with each other, coordinating on a single issue like this.
So what is the state of net neutrality right now? And again, Hayden Ludwig is with me, investigative researcher at Capital Research Center, and who are great supporters of Breitbart, and they've got a big piece out this morning on the front page of Breitbart. Well, what is the state of this debate? Because it's a key debate, and we can't lose sight of it just because we're winning it at the moment, but it doesn't mean that people aren't here to fight.
And that's the key thing. So President Trump undid them in 2017 as one of his earlier actions. And if you remember, the left claimed the sky would fall down. It would destroy the internet. The country would implode, et cetera. Obviously, none of that happened. It's typical hysteria. But they haven't given up on it right now. Free press has kind of made it its goal to reenact net neutrality. The way they can do it, though, is they either have to do it through Congress or they have to get control of the FCC, which controls these communications, in order to pass that. Well, right now, with a Republican in the White House, they can't get control of the FCC. Through the House, theoretically, they could pass net neutrality regulations. The good news is that they tried this strategy in the House in around 2010, and it failed. They couldn't pass it all the way through. Even Democrats had a hard time rallying behind it, let alone Republicans. So they have a sense of, like many of their other projects, we have to force this through the presidency and the executive branch because the Congress just simply won't get behind these kinds of radical takeover strategies. They're just too sensitive to people. People know when they're being had, and they don't appreciate this. So the big fear would be in 2020, if a Democrat wins, I would watch out for net neutrality to make an ugly reoccurrence.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And this is one where the people who are for net neutrality, again, doing the bunny ears, it's not a real term. It's a political term of art. They're much more passionate than the people who are opposed to it. And I do think it would lead to government control of the internet. I think that's where it's headed. Hayden Ludwig, great stuff. Read the full report at Breitbart.com and come back soon, my friend.
Thank you very much.
All right. We'll be right back with your calls.